I want to share my unique thoughts about how do you put it all together. It's been an interesting evening. We've heard a lot of different viewpoints, talked about our patients. Obviously, in the neuro ICU, we take care of the severely brain injured patients. We fight our battles over long periods of time, over days and days where the brain is vulnerable to secondary injury. And as we just heard from the prior speaker, Dr. Hogue, we certainly do live in a high-tech environment. We've got a lot of measurements that we can work with now as we try to support the brain, combining brain support with life support. So obviously, we're focused on the neurological examination. This is really our primary, ultimate measure of how our patients are doing. We do that by doing a sedation interruption and checking what's happening with our patient, reacting to pain, are they making eye contact? This is kind of our bottom line. But we all know that while we're doing those clinical neurologic assessments, we can take our intermittent structural images of the brain, our daily CT scans or our every other day CT scans, but a lot of what's happening in between is kind of a black box. And what multimodality monitoring allows us to do is to go inside the black box and measure in real time what's happening to the physiology of the human injured comatose brain. So my friend and former colleague at Columbia, Mike Schmidt, made these slides, and he likens it this way. When your patient's awake, it's like flying an airplane in the daytime. That examination is good enough. We can check responsiveness because the brain is functioning at a high level. And it's going to be relatively easy for us as clinicians at the bedside to tell when things are starting to slip. Patients become less coherent, less responsive, more lethargic. We develop our subtle neurologic signs, our pronator drifts. So we can fly the airplane really the way we would ordinarily just by looking. But when patients are in coma, we've lost that high-level functioning. We're basically flying in darkness, and if it's not bad enough that we don't have high-level brain function to work with, the patients are often sedated on top of that because of the severity of their illness. And what that comes down to is bad things can happen in the brain. Secondary injury, swelling, infarction, and at the end of the day, when we figure out finally that there's been more destruction of the brain, we're really only figuring this out after the damage is done. So the only rational way to manage the severely brain injured patient is to use the monitoring that is available to us to detect the early derangements in brain physiology as soon as possible, to give us that early situational awareness and allow us to correct that harmful pathology, these harmful physiologic processes, before the secondary injury becomes permanent. And he likens that to, imagine trying to fly a plane in the darkness in the dead of night. No, you wouldn't do that. You have your gauges, you have your monitors, right? Your altimeters, your speedometers, etc. Based on that principle, over the years at Columbia, we developed a philosophy. And the philosophy was as such: if you're a candidate for an invasive intracranial monitor, right? So if we're worried that you've got a severe brain injury, you're in a coma, the CT scan shows damage, and there's problems with swelling or mass effect, and 3, you're a patient worth fighting for, if we're going to drill a hole anyway and put an ICP monitor in, we're going to go full Monty, and we're going to put in a neuromonitoring bundle. So this is the era of the multimodality neuromonitoring bundle. It started at about 2006 when we started with a dual lumen bolt, ICP plus LICOX. Then we went with a triple lumen bolt. We added the microdialysis. And then we added a second dual lumen bolt for actual tissue CBF monitoring and an EEG depth electrode. So that became our standard montage of monitoring for trauma, poor grade SAH or ICH. And then we expanded that beyond to patients with refractory status epilepticus, with encephalitis, and even patients with cardiac arrest. And most of my talk tonight's going to be focusing on cardiac arrest. It's an illness of great interest to me, and I think that there's a place for looking at CBF after cardiac arrest as well. We've heard about all the other forms of brain injury, stroke, et cetera. And the point's been made many times tonight, I don't want to belabor it, that there are problems with having riches of different forms of information, right? When you've got brain multimodality monitoring and you see all the lines and the squiggles and the beeping lights and everything else, how do you begin to make sense of all that information? And so my first message is that once you expand beyond MAP and ICP, so if you have let's say you have any measure of cerebral blood flow at all, because that's what we're here to talk about tonight, you're not really unlocking the power of this monitoring unless you can link it and bring it all together with some form of an integrated monitoring system. So having a simple box there with a number that says the cerebral blood flow index is 72, or the cerebral blood flow value is 32, is almost close to useless unless there's a cable connecting that to the MAP and the end-tidal CO2 and the arterial O2, et cetera. And as we add the other components of the monitoring, you want it all networked in together. The way I think about it is like this. What you see on the right are what I call the physiologic drivers. So these are actually the variables that nourish and perfuse and oxygenate and feed the brain. And these are the things that we can control. We can raise the blood pressure pharmacologically. We can drop it. We can hyperventilate. We can cool. We can sedate you to reduce metabolic demand and the like. On the left-hand side are the measures, these new technologies that are coming at us constantly. It's almost more than we can deal with, that are giving us the ability to measure physiologic brain health. And of course, cerebral blood flow, as we've heard, is paramount here. And we can measure EEG activity, we can measure metabolism with microdialysis, and at Columbia, we're still doing microdialysis. The experiences are different, and we're going to start doing it at Mount Sinai soon. So the idea is, how do you turn the dials on the right and set these physiologic drivers to move our indicators of brain health out of the red zone when they're in the danger zone and into the green zone, the happy zone, the healthy zone? The idea for me of multimodality monitoring is to identify, establish, and maintain an optimized physiologic environment for the injured brain that's vulnerable to secondary injury. The systems that we have to integrate this data, there's basically two flavors. There's the networked ICU, and this is a picture of the Columbia Neuro ICU that I snapped in 2007, right before we moved in, and every room had network connections, and we had a server in a closet that was able to collect and grab all the information, and then it was all transferred onto an SQL database that we could access and query. And then there are the bedside solutions. The best known these days is the Moberg CNS monitor, where you can bring that in and you can make all those connections right there in the room. But one way or another, you need to make the connections. So you can look at the relationships. So how do these relationships work? Well, this is a LICOX monitor, and I'm going to focus on LICOX. And again, my point is LICOX is one type of measurement of brain perfusion, but there are many others that we have, and we're probably going to be moving over time away from invasive towards non-invasive monitoring of cerebral blood flow. Because if you think about it, it's less dangerous, and also importantly, it allows us to get that much far forward at the point of injury, where into the golden hour of injury, the earliest moments, by simply, let's say, applying simple sensors to the forehead. So LICOX, I'm sure you all know, measures brain tissue oxygen tension. It's obviously a focal monitor. And what we know about LICOX is that in all the studies that have looked at it, various forms of hemorrhage and trauma, the more brain tissue hypoxia that occurs during the course of illness, the worse patients do. What influences a brain tissue oxygen level? Well, when we first started using these monitors, we didn't really even know. I personally didn't even know if blood pressure fluctuations would be able to move a brain tissue oxygen level. The thought was, although it's not really cerebral blood flow, maybe if you grant that other circumstances are the same, maybe it's correlated with blood flow. And I'm just going to point out how much work we have to do in this field, because Howard Jonas earlier, or one of our speakers earlier, showed data establishing that there was no relationship of PbTO2 or brain tissue oxygen levels in CBF. The experience that I've had is actually quite different, and I've used LICOX as an indicator of brain perfusion. Why? Well, here's one of the earliest examples looking. This is back in the prehistoric age, 1998. This is Claudia Robertson, one of the great pioneers in our field. And simply, as you see down there on the bottom, she hyperventilates the patient, end-tidal CO2 goes down, PbTO2 goes down. Then she hyperoxygenates by dialing up the FiO2. And you see it's a physiologic responsive sensor. It's responding the way that we would expect to. My own personal story started with this patient. This was a poor grade subarachnoid hemorrhage patient with a large space occupying clot in the sylvian fissure. Patient had the aneurysm clipped, was decompressed, and we put one of our very first LICOX sensors into the right frontal lobe of the brain. What I want to draw your attention to is you see the PbTO2 up on top kind of bouncing up and down. And that's measuring brain tissue oxygen in the brain. And you see in the middle panel the cerebral perfusion pressure. This is the mean arterial pressure minus ICP. And you see that these two curves have a striking parallel similarity. They're moving up and down together. Clearly, this patient is not autoregulating, and the PbTO2 levels are dependent on the CPP levels. So the insight is that if you've got CBF or some reasonable facsimile of it that you can run reliably online, like a LICOX, CBF, TCD, I guess, theoretically, but doing continuous TCD is very difficult to do for practical reasons. What you can do is you can take that data over a clip of time and plot it. And that's the data from that patient on a simple 2x2 scatter plot. And now what you see is that using a CBF monitor connected to our physiologic drivers, you can actually image brain autoregulation. This is this patient's autoregulatory curve. It looks just like this. Where the future is going to go is that as we get better computing, we'll be running real-time CPP map, real-time CBF, and using streaming, we're going to be able to continuously image an autoregulatory curve right there at the bedside. We'll be able to see it, and as we've heard from many of our speakers tonight, we'll then be able to use that patient's physiology to individualize our physiologic targets. So no more guessing about what blood pressure to do, or arguing about it on rounds, or just going with guidelines and making sure we don't let it go to critically low levels like below 50. We're going to be much more sophisticated in what we do. And as we've seen with PbTO2, this is an intracerebral hemorrhage with a LICOX sensor in the perihematomal brain. We know this is the area where the action is, where the brain is at risk, where the battle's being won and lost, actually. We did some work among a number of other studies, and simply to point out here, if you take a large cohort of comatose ICH patients, and then we basically look at all these measurements, this is hours and hours and hours and thousands of measurements, and what you see here is that when you mash it up, the lower the cerebral perfusion pressure, as the dotted line shows, the more brain tissue hypoxia you're going to be seeing. So the relationships seem to work in the way that we would expect them to work. Let's take a look now at cardiac arrest. This is the ultimate challenge for us. This is us battling death. And as we know, hypothermia has been the game changer. Even though now we can argue about whether or not we want to do 33 or 36, the truth is we're all doing TTM. And we've taken an untreatable disease, an untreatable cause of devastating brain damage, and we've made it treatable. And I think that that's the game changer. I want to remind you that cardiac arrest is very different from a stroke, right? This is what CBF would be in a permanent occlusion. This is CBF in a temporary occlusion lasting 2.5 hours. Cardiac arrest is extremely different. It's about 5 minutes of pure no flow before the start of CPR. It's 20 minutes of misery perfusion during CPR. And assuming you get to ROSC at that average of 25 minutes, then you get a brief rebound hyperemia. And then we know very well that then what happens for hours and hours and hours when patients come into our units is there's a low reflow phenomenon that's thought to be due to diffuse circulatory capillary dysfunction and shutdown. So some number of years ago, we embarked on a project at Columbia where we offered brain multimodality monitoring to cardiac arrest patients. This data was presented at NCS a couple of years ago, and these are still, it's a series of 18 patients, but it's, as far as I know, the largest series of invasive monitoring in cardiac arrest. One thing we learned was, one thing that I learned personally though, is that drilling holes in the brain of cardiac arrest patients is never going to be the future. I think that we need non-invasive modalities to look. What did we see? Well, baseline values are exactly what you would have expected based on the experimental models. CBF is low because metabolism's low. PbTO2 at 23 is the lower limit of normal, and lactate pyruvate ratio indicating a shift towards anaerobic metabolism is increased. But what we established was that over 72 hours, there's a prolonged window where the brain is vulnerable to secondary injury. These injuries are PaO2 desats, episodes of hypotension, seizures, and paroxysmal hyperventilation. Anyone who's taking care of cardiac arrest knows this is exactly what's happening over the hours that they're in your unit when they come upstairs from the ED. So here's an example. You see PbTO2 here in the middle panel, moving up and down, seemingly in parallel with the CPP. And then at the end, though, you see the PbTO2 go down, but the CPP is high. What's going on here? Well, the brain, now the patient's having O2 desats that are bringing down the PbTO2. So yes, there are many different inputs into the system, and it showed the very dynamic nature of what's happening in the brain. Tissue oxygen tension shown here on the bottom. This is an example of paroxysms of hypertension driving up, presumably CBF and PbTO2 in parallel. So clearly, I think still a very dynamic situation where the brain may be very vulnerable. This is that same patient data now plotted, PbTO2 here on the Y, and you see the CPP, and you see a nice autoregulatory curve effect. Really just the challenges all come from the acuity of the patient themselves. And then just this data, which is unpublished, showing that when you look at non-survivors on the bottom compared to survivors, the PbTO2 or brain tissue hypoxia is most severe in the first day, and then less severe in the second day. So it's that earliest day, those first hours, really where we see the most physiologic derangement, and probably where a lot of that battle is being won and lost. This is a case report we published some years ago showing a patient with cardiac arrest who was in minimally convulsive status. And you see the PbTO2 levels going down, and after control of the seizures, they stabilize in purple at a nice higher level, and the CBF in green is surging up by those seizures as well. So we have a live biological system. We started getting interested in non-invasive brain perfusion, and we initially started some studies with Nonin, which is a regional brain hemoglobin saturation monitor. While we were doing that work at Columbia, Dr. Sam Parnia published this article. He was looking at the same concept, but he was actually putting these monitors on during CPR. And what he was able to show here was that the baseline measurements during CPR seemed to be highly associated with whether or not the patient would attain ROSC or not in hospital cardiac arrest. And this is just some of our data using Nonin, and you see here some of the challenges on the bottom this is the right and the left frontal, and you see some of the challenges that we confront with this research, inability, at least initially, to get a nice stable signal. The other interesting thing about this data, and I apologize, it's hard to read, was that in about the middle of the recording period, the patient actually became clinically brain dead. So the patient is now clinically brain dead, and yes, we see that regional brain hemoglobin sat trending down, but not in a dramatic way, not dropping to zero the way we might have expected, and similar to the comments we heard from Camilo Gomez. So there's still some puzzles. We started working with the Ornim system in cardiac arrest as well, and unfortunately I don't have a lot of group data to show you, but this is a clip of just one patient. The earlier device that was a prototype that we were using measured both hemoglobin saturation, shown right and left above, and then basically the cerebral perfusion index, or the C-flow index. And this is really measuring capillary cerebral blood flow by sending a light signal in, pulsing it with ultrasound, and by creating more Doppler shift with more flow, it's able to extract and estimate brain perfusion. The point here, to me, is that the cerebral blood flow itself in a technology like Ornim is a lot more dynamic. And I think that I've reached the conclusion that hemoglobin sat of the brain, which is largely venous in fact, is probably much more of a downstream kind of physiologic measurement, and that it's really the changes on the flow side that are going to be more dynamically affected by blood pressure and by end-tidal CO2. And that even when someone becomes brain dead, that hemoglobin sat tends to take a long time to kind of slide down and move down. So in the spirit of Star Trek, it's duty now for the future. Yes, I do believe multimodality monitoring is moving in the direction of non-invasive monitoring. There's a lot of very interesting work to be done still, and I think that my hope for all of you in the audience tonight is that you're with us here on the vanguard of trying to address these questions and trying to figure out where it all fits and how it all fits together. Thank you very much.